just sibling rivalry writ large. The Holocaust doesn't fit in that pattern, right? In the Holocaust, the Germans and their many, many helpers killed fellow citizens. So the Jews of Germany, of Poland, of Hungary weren't obvious enemies the way, during the First World War, let's say, the French and the Germans were very obvious enemies. They were facing each other across trenches, wearing uniforms and facing each other with rifles and cannons. The Holocaust, the Germans killed fellow citizens who paid taxes, fought in the First World War for them, garnered any number of Nobel Prizes for the Germans. So as a child, I didn't quite get, it makes sense to hate your enemy, but why would you hate your friend? So it always puzzled me and it stayed with me. And then, many years went by and a number of books went by, and after writing Life of Pi, I thought I'd look at the Holocaust and see what I could do with it as a writer, what I could do with it as a writer. And I came to notice that the way we think of the Holocaust is very, very limited. Most novels on the Holocaust are in fact autobiographical. They're either biographical or autobiographical. So, a very famous book, let's say Night by Elie Wiesel, it's the story of a 15-year-old kid who ends up in a camp and how he survives. Well, you read about Elie Wiesel and you find out he was a 15-year-old in a concentration camp and he survived. There's very little true fiction on the Holocaust, whereas there's lots of fiction on war. We have no hesitation inventing stories about war. I'll give you an obvious example, one that some of your students might know. The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane is a short classic American novel about the American Civil War. It's incredibly vivid about the feeling of being in battle. Well, Stephen Crane, not only did he not fight in the Civil War, he wasn't even born. He just invented that story. He did research, obviously. He used his imagination. And yet it's had to be a classic war tale. We don't have that with the Holocaust. You have very few real fiction with the Holocaust. And I asked myself, why do we do that? Why don't we invent tales when it comes to the Holocaust? And there's a number of reasons why, but anyway, Beatrice and Virgil is my attempt to witness the Holocaust, but not in a literal way. So, once again, it features animals. What can be more obviously allegorical than the use of talking animals? So unlike in Life of Pi, where the animals don't talk, in Beatrice and Virgil, the animals do talk. So I tried to sort of digest the Holocaust in an artistic way, not in a historical way. And, students, readers will have to see, how I succeed, what they get out of it.
Well, thank you very much, and
pleasure.
I'll have some students come on up and they'll introduce themselves. Thank
okay.
you.
Hello.
Hi there, Mr. Martel. My name is Jacob Donahoe.
Hello, Jacob.
Other than new insights, what do you hope your readers get from your past and present novels?
Well, first and foremost, entertained. You want a novel to be fun. There's absolutely no reason to read a novel that completely bores you. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to work. You don't want to be a lazy reader. But at one point, you have to enjoy a novel. So, first and foremost, hopefully, they get some kind of enjoyment. Other than that, maybe what you mentioned. Hopefully, after reading a book, you are slightly different. You're slightly changed. You either know a bit more, or feel a bit more, or feel that much wiser. I always think of reading a book as being like a life, and when you read it, you've lived that life. So if you read 10 books, you've lived 10 lives. You've lived the lives of those characters, and you've gained whatever one gains from living. A little ounce of wisdom, an ounce of fun. You're that much better, hopefully, a better person.
Thank you very much. One little quick question after that. We only get to see little snippets of Pi's life, so why is the novel titled Life of Pi instead of Slice of Pie?
It's funny, the title, I find when I work on a book, I don't really think much about the title. What really counts is the 100, 200, 300 pages of prose that you're writing. And so for Life of Pi, early on I just called it Life of Pi because I couldn't think of anything else to call it. And finally the title just kind of stuck. I kind of liked it. But I guess essentially I call it Life of Pi because you're right, it's not the entirety of his life. In fact, it's only maybe 1 or 2 years of his life, right? He's at sea for, what is it again, I forget, 217 days or something. And you hear a little bit about his childhood.
227 days.
There we go, 227. So you only get a slice of his life, as you say, but it's the most significant part of his life, I guess. You know, you don't write novels about humdrum days. You write novels about extraordinary days. So those seem to be the days of his life that are the most symbolic, the weightiest, the one that changed him the most.
All right. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Jacob.
I'm on the way.
It's funny, if there weren't a camera and all you people might feel like I'm a priest hearing confession.
Let me tell you my sins, Mr. Martel.
We're already forgiven, don't worry.
So, first question I have for you is not literary at all. What do you call a bagel that can fly?
I don't know. What do you call a bagel that can fly?
A plain bagel.
I forgive you.
Okay, first question I have. Are you still as quote-unquote hungry as you were when you wrote Life of Pi? Like, did the novel satisfy your emotional hunger at that time?
Yes, it did. It absolutely did. There's something incredibly pleasurable about being creative. And whether it's writing a novel or gardening or cooking or whatever, it is a great pleasure to create something out of nothing. And so the 4 years I took to write Life of Pi, I loved it. Unlike the two subsequent novels, Beatrice and Virgil, which some of you might read, and the one I'm working on now, which have changed a lot in the editing process, Life of Pi came to me quite quickly. It took me 4 years to write, but it was all easy. On the odd day I had to think about things, but essentially it flowed very easily. All the research I did nourished the novel. The writing of the novel, which took about 2 years, came together very well. And in the editing process, very, very little change. There's one scene, if you remember, there's that scene where Pi is blind and the tiger's blind and they meet a blind Frenchman. And that whole scene was, that dialogue they had at sea was originally much longer. It was about 50 pages, and it was too long. It was starting to be a story in its own right, and I cut it substantially. That was essentially the only substantial change I made to the novel. Everything else was what we call line editing. In other words, just little things in a sentence here and there. And that hasn't been my subsequent experience. The two novels I've written since, there's been a slight fall from grace. I think, and this is the classic dilemma of a writer. You have this idea, you're moved by it, you write it down, you love it, you think something's on the page, and then your editor reads it and says, well, this is really boring, or this doesn't make sense, or I don't understand why your character's saying this. And that didn't happen with Life of Pi. It has happened with the other two. It's been more work. So that was a great experience, and I'm still hungry. Mind you, my hunger now, when I wrote Life of Pi, I didn't have children. Now I have 3, and I have a 4th on the way due in about 6 weeks. So I have less time to be hungry in a literary fashion.
And so, another question. Was there a specific impetus responsible for the concept that would become Life of Pi? Talk about that idea that you're moved by it. Was there a specific idea that moved you to write Life of Pi?
Several things. Most obviously a trip to India. I'd been to India before, just backpacking, and I was blown away by the country, by the richness of it, the diversity of the country. It's an absolutely stunning country to visit. Most educated Indians, in fact, anyone with the least bit of education just speaks English. So despite being a very foreign country in many ways, it's a very accessible country. Unlike China, for example, where most Chinese do not speak a word of English, and therefore there's a sort of a wall between you and your average Chinese, not just the Great Wall of China, but a real,
You beat me, I was like, is there a Great Wall?
Yeah, well, there's a sort of a cultural wall that's very hard to overcome. In India, there isn't that wall. You can't communicate with people. So their foreignness is very accessible. It's just absolutely dazzling country. So that blew me away. And also, I guess the time of my age when I got there the second time, I had written 2 books. They'd done modestly well critically, very poor sales. And I was sort of hungry for a story, getting back to the thing of hunger. And I got to India, and I was blown away by the country. And for the first time in my life, I noticed something that's very present in India and not very present where I come from. I'm originally from Quebec, from French Canada. which now is a very secular society. The churches, all of them, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Protestant, whatever you want, have been marginalized in Quebec. Quebec is a much less religious society than most of the United States is. And so I grew up in a completely non-religious household. And when I got to India for the first time in my life, really, I started noticing the presence of religion in a more sympathetic light than I did in Canada. It's very easy to hate religion. You know, the Catholic Church is homophobic, patriarchal, sexist, all these things. All the religions have, organized religions have problems. And if you want to hate religion, it's very easy to find reasons why. But while I was in India, since I don't know Hinduism that well, I'm not a Hindu, no Hindu has ever oppressed me, I sort of had a more benign view of it. And I suddenly became intrigued at exploring religion, not from the perspective of wanting to find reasons, more reasons to dislike it, but I sort of asked myself, why do people still practice religion in the 21st century? You know, modernity has been going on for 300 years. Science and technology has been triumphant. You know, the very fact that we're speaking, we're 1,000, hundreds of miles apart, and we're talking to each other, that's a result of technology. How can people still be believing in gods in the face of the triumph of science? So I became intrigued by this thing called faith. And that was the starting point for Life of Pi. So I guess the simple question is India was the key thing. If I had been traveling somewhere else, I would have written a very different novel.
Very good. Speaking of when you were talking about novels and reading and that you read a life, Pi Patel, the character, how human do you consider Pi Patel? And also, if you were given the chance, would you speak with him as a person if he could exist?
Well, I spoke to him for 4 years when I was writing the book. I think a character well, unless we're talking of George R.R. Martin, who has thousands of characters, but in your average novel, I think most of them are sort of alter egos of their creators. So, if Pi is religious, is interested in religion, that obviously reflects the fact that I am still interested in religion. So he's sort of a facet of me, a limited facet of me. I'm not Hindu, I've never been stuck in a lifeboat with a tiger, thank God. So he represents sort of an interest that I have. But really, a character is alive to the reader, to the creator. The creator is more like an engineer. I'll give you an example, a concrete one. The Statue of Liberty. The engineer for the Statue of Liberty was a man named Gustave Eiffel. The same man who built the Eiffel Tower. Gustave Eiffel built the Eiffel Tower and was the engineer for the Statue of Liberty. I don't think he particularly cared what the Statue of Liberty might mean to Americans. He was just concerned that it wouldn't fall over, that the arm would stand, that the head wouldn't fall off, that the whole thing. So he was on the inside making sure she would stand. As a creator of a character in a novel, it's kind of the same thing. I'm on the inside and he just has to sound good. So he's Indian, his English has to sound Indian, his religious references have to be true. What he might mean to readers, I left that to the reader, just as Eiffel left Americans to interpret the Statue of Liberty. So my perspective was more internal and technical and less sort of holistic, the way you might come to him as a reader.
Very good analogy. And one final question. Speaking of us speaking with you and learning all these things about Life of Pi through you, do you believe that a work ought to be studied without the author in mind, or do you believe knowledge of the author enhances the understanding of the reader?
Oh no, very much the first. You definitely don't need the author. I have received a lot of letters about the book, and I'm always like, people often ask me, explain the island to me, or which story is true. And the problem I have with that is, yes, I wrote the book, but I'm nonetheless only one reader among many. And my answer isn't necessarily the correct one. I don't think there is a correct one, it's all a question of interpretation. Now, I had a certain intent, obviously. I could tell you, well, this is what I intended. But that doesn't really matter. What really counts is what you get out of it. And broadly speaking, there's a great variety of interpretations. And to me, they're all, if it rings true to you, then that's fine. No, I think it's a weak novel that needs the author to interpret it. I'll give you an example. I'm trying to think. Many readers have read the book and said things about it that I hadn't thought. And that's totally fine with me. So for example, this is what you just mentioned, in 227 days, the length of time that pi is at sea, 22 divided by 7 is what? Is pi. Now I had noticed that. I knew 227 was a prime number, but 22 divided by 7 as being roughly equivalent to pi, I hadn't. So that's something where the reader interpreted in the way that I didn't. And I'll give you even a better one. Getting back to how do you interpret characters, I have this tiger in this novel. I had to make sure that the tiger was realistic, that people didn't take him as like Tigger from Jungle Book, but rather like a real live tiger. So I did all my research on animal behavior, etc. I didn't think any further than that. I wanted the reader to believe that there was a tiger. It wasn't my concern how readers would specifically interpret the tiger. So the first time around, I was getting letters and questions from readers saying, Mr. Martel, what does the tiger signify? And I honestly, the first times I heard that question, I didn't know. I said, well, gosh, I don't know. And then readers started saying, well, I think the tiger represents God. I said, oh, gosh, that's a good idea. So next time someone asked me, what is Richard Parkman? I said, well, he could represent God. I was trying to feed back to readers what other readers had given me. So, the writer obviously is consequential, but I don't think he's essential, he or she's not essential in how a book's interpreted. It's up to the reader to figure it out. And in fact, if you get an answer from a writer, the danger is you'll sort of stop thinking imaginatively about the book. You'll think, oh, this is the answer and that's all I need to know, and they all stop thinking about it. I think it's better if there's still areas of mystery where you have to do the work, you have to co-create the novel in a sense. I think that's a much better approach.
Very good. So before I leave you, I'll ask you one final thing. Did you hear about the two guys that stole a calendar?
That stole the calendar? No, I didn't.
You got 6 months.
Go in peace, my son, and sin no more.
Brendan, come in and go.
No promises.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Rebecca.
Hello, Rebecca.
Hi. Okay, so my question to you is, despite your successes, are you still compelled to write constantly?
No, as I mentioned, I have 3 children now. They're all under 5. In fact, in a month's time, I'll have 4 children under 5. So in a sense, those are kind of 4 little books running around, and I have to write them every day. I still want to write because it's fun, and I have to fill my days. And I'm still trying to understand things. So I do. I don't maybe quite have that same hunger I had when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. But you get into habits, You get into habits of writing, and there's nothing else I'd rather do. So yeah, I do continue. The thing though is, it does get harder because there's only so many novels one has in one. Unless you're a genius like Shakespeare or whatever, so you don't quite have the wealth of ideas that you have when you start. But still, I still love doing it. It's a beautiful thing to write, to create. You take these little